Hello, my name is Jenica Sell. Welcome to our program entitled Viewpoints. If you're interested in learning about deaf culture and improving your ASL reception, this is the opportunity you will have in this videotape. We've asked 6 deaf people to share their experiences and opinions and viewpoints for this program. I took it upon myself to ask them a series of questions which they then answered, and you'll be able to improve your receptive skills by interpreting their answers and improve your ASL. If you'd like to increase your challenge, you can turn off the volume so you don't hear the provided voice interpreting. If you do need help, don't worry, you can always turn the volume back on. If you're ready, let's dive in and begin the program. Good luck. Interpreters, question 1. As a consumer of interpreters, when you have an interpreter in a particular situation, when do you decide to use one and when don't you use an interpreter? Brenda's saying, in the past, I was very embarrassed about using an interpreter at a doctor's appointment. I preferred to write notes. But then, if I did use an interpreter, I realized I was getting more information from the doctor, more information about my medical condition. So I put my pride aside and decided to use interpreters. I realized that interpreters had a code of ethics, that they wouldn't be sharing this confidential information, so that made it feel better. If there's a brief encounter I have with somebody that doesn't use sign language, I would prefer to write notes. But if it's an important business matter or something much more urgent, such as a medical appointment, I'll use an interpreter. I don't like using a family member as an interpreter. I remember I used to ask family members to interpret movies for me. We'd go to that a movie and I would use that. I have a husband who can hear, and we would go to a movie and he would interpret for me, and I would hear people laughing at the movie, and I would never understand why, because his interpretation was not able to convey that. So later, I watched the same movie, and I put the caption on. I realized, oh my goodness, my husband missed on so much information. So again, I will always use an interpreter for an important matter. Like recently I had an important business meeting that I needed, and I had an interpreter for that. And interestingly, I used this interpreter and I noticed that they were waiting a long time to get the information before they would respond. And I guess it was their needing to make sure they understood the message clearly before conveying it, but that was an interesting experience. Ed saying, I don't like to depend on interpreters if I don't have to, but if someone is willing to sign with me, or I can lip read them, I will prefer to go without an interpreter. But if it's more serious, like say a surgery, for example, I would definitely use an interpreter for that. If I have a professional business meeting or something like that, I'll also use an interpreter. If I'm going to a lecture and I want to understand what's going on, or if there's a dialogue that I need to understand with somebody, I will use an interpreter. There are positives and negatives, however, to using an interpreter. For example, in a classroom situation, often an interpreter will be placed in there who is not experienced in that particular field. If I can find an interpreter who has the background in that particular specialty, I will definitely use them. If not, I would prefer not to have an interpreter. Like if an interpreter has no knowledge of technical knowledge in a computer class or a science class, that is not to my liking. In that case, I would prefer a transliteration of the English exactly, and then I will interpret myself so that there's less frustration and less errors. Marilyn's saying, I would use interpreters for my employment when I had workshops or trainings at that particular venue. Sometimes, I would insist that the interpreter had certification and was an expert, and I didn't want someone who was going to go off the point and not be able to convey what I was trying to express, or vice versa. Sometimes I found it frustrating to find a good interpreter in those situations, so it had its challenges. Mark saying, yes, I use interpreters often. When I worked for the state, I used them. When I was giving lectures, interpreters would be my voice for these lectures that I would give to a hearing audience. I would use them at college workshops, for example. Interpreters would convey the information and both from the lecture and from my questions to the audience. To be honest, it was very much a challenge to find an interpreter who I felt could convey my information into spoken English. That was a big challenge. Sometimes I felt like the interpreters didn't get the nuances of my lecture or my questions. I felt like sometimes interpreters would need to, watch my lecture a few times before they got it perfectly. It was interesting. When I went for my advanced degree in college, I remember the same issue. There would be some awkwardness, and so I found that a challenge as well. Jenny's saying, maybe going to a doctor or different business situations. Sometimes interpreters would understand, sometimes not in these situations. If not, I would sometimes have to write. And I was surprised that if I would go to a doctor and maybe write back and forth, there would be no interpreters and it could work. That was fine. Sometimes an interpreter would help to make the information clearer. David saying, I don't tend to use interpreters often. Really just two situations. In an educational setting and in a medical, like a health-related situation. I'm a teacher, and I go to different workshops through my profession, and it's important for me to have an interpreter as a bridge in communication to help me understand what's going on and help people understand what I'm contributing. And then it's also important in a health-related matter. There have been times when I've written back and forth with doctors, and I know interpreters are now mandated in most of these kinds of situations. So I think it's better. It gives it gives the flow of communication more ease. Other times I use interpreters, I can't really say. Maybe like if I guess a concern is if it's a very personal interaction where I'm conveying very personal information. I don't want the interpreter there because I'd be afraid they'd share my information with others. So in that case, I'd prefer to write back and forth. Interpreter's question 2. Now, sometimes you can have a real rapport with an interpreter who understands what's going on, and sometimes you have an interpreter where the communication flow is not so clear. Can you share experiences that you've had in those two cases? Ed saying, One example would be of miscommunication would be like somebody like, well, actually someone who's not missing communication, somebody like Lou Font or Betty Colonimus. I can remember them being very skilled in many situations. I remember, I guess I would have to say, I sort of blank out the interpreting experiences that are negative because I don't want to remember them. But I remember going to a festival, a deaf festival, and there was an interpreter, really a friend who was a new interpreter, and there was a meeting with a faculty advisor, and this person agreed to interpret. I introduced this person as my interpreter to the faculty advisor, and then his wife said something like, I said, my friend Kevin is a student at somewhere, missed that. And then my wife said something, there was some mention of a wife, so my advisor was like, you've never mentioned a wife. So, it was a miscommunication because, I don't think they were able to convey the fact that it was me or them who was being talked about. So that's why I prefer to use a professional interpreter rather than just a friend. Marilyn saying, well, I worked for Department of Justice, and at that time I went into, it was my first experience working within hearing population. I wasn't really used to working with interpreters. I saw interpreters working in different ways. I know that they follow an ethical code. There are different levels of interpreters. I was used to working with interpreters in one way and not another, but I did notice that different interpreters, there are different levels of certification, some good, some not. I would attend different meetings. I would understand, more, just given that there was an interpreter there, it was better than nothing. But some interpreters would be able to match my communication style, some not. So when I found people that were able to really do the job well, that made me realize that there was a difference between a really good interpreter and one that wasn't so good. You know, I would bear with interpreters that weren't as qualified. I never really said I could have a bad experience with even with the bad ones. I was able to work things out. Mark was saying, you know, I remember I met two interpreters, students from an interpreter training program, and I was at a college, community college, and I met this one gentleman, and I asked him what interpreting means, and he was able to explain, you know, what the profession meant. This was when I was a student, and I started thinking about that more and more. Asking him what the process of interpreting is. So, you know, what the actual steps of going from a visual language to a spoken language, and I found it very interesting to find out more information about this. It was a lot of examples were given to me of, you know, how he would convey spoken English into sign language, and that helped me understand the process better. And there were occasional misfires and errors within interpreting experiences I had. I remember going to a lecture and getting a kind of a picture of what the lecture was about, and then at the end of the lecture, the interpreter realized, oh my God, I've been completely off track, and the interpreter had to excuse themselves and say, oh my God, I've misunderstood, and had to kind of catch up and repair what they had conveyed incorrectly. You know, interpreters sometimes have to go back and fix things, but I do have to say I'm grateful for the fact that they took that upon themselves and were able to be humble enough to admit their mistake and go back and repair what they had misinterpreted. Brenda's saying, oh yes, yes indeed. Let me explain first a bad experience I had. I went to a work function or a training, professional development session, and it was a large audience of peoples. I think the Verizon thing was on the screen or something, and I went into the meeting, and the interpreter had this bright red lipstick and bright nail polish and a red shirt, and I saw this person begin to interpret, and I became so distracted and downright dizzy from just the style of clothing, the red background, the red clothes, the nails, everything. I said, you know, could you, you know, do something about this? I mean, the person had jewelry on and everything, and it was just difficult to even read the information. The interpreter said, oh, thank you for telling me. They went and dealt with things, and then they said they were going, and they came back and they had the same red lipstick on, and I was like, my goodness. I didn't really know my rights at the time as far as being able to complain about this particular interpreter. I wasn't really sure what to do. Now I know better. I wouldn't put up with it. You know, I was like, you're a professional, but I did put up with it. You know, at that time, interpreters were not really under a business. They were freelance. You know, there was nobody to really hold them accountable. I guess you could contact the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, the professional organization, to complain, but you know, I remember I took a class at Western Maryland College, I think it was. There was this woman there, and I remember the first day of class, there was an interpreter. The teacher was there too, and I remember going on, and as days went on, I realized the teacher became more, she was an African American, more kind of, how can I say it, conveyed the culture of of Africanness more and more as the class went on, and the interpreter was able to convey that as well. It was fascinating, you know. And she was a white person, the interpreter, but she was able to match this person. It was fascinating to see, you know. And one day I said, you know, can I ask a personal question? I said, you know, I noticed that the first day of class you were very professionally dressed, and now you're much more casual, much more African in your nature and your dress and your behavior. I mean, I like it. It's beautiful, but it's just interesting. And then the teacher began laughing and said, oh, I'm happy you noticed that. And it was true. At the college level, people looked down on African dress on the first day. She felt like, you know, she had to set an example. And then later, I guess, felt like she didn't have to. I'm, you know, learning about this myself, you know. This was a sociology class. So the interpreter was able to convey that as well. I guess they had worked together, worked with her for a while, and the interpreter was able to convey this switch that she made through the class as well. It was really quite interesting. Interpreter's question 3. It seems that more and more people are interested in becoming interpreters, hearing people, that is. And what do you think it's important for us to teach them as deaf people as they become interpreters? Mark's saying, well, the main thing, if we want them to improve, if we want them to develop a good, how can we say, awareness of what their weaknesses are, what they need to work on, so that they can recognize that, accept it, and be willing to develop. I think, you know, comes to attitude as well. I think that's very important. In some situations, people are aware of these kinds of things, and I think it's also important for them to people to understand and be honest with things, and instead of saying, you know, oh, I know this, I know that, but no, I think it's important for people to have the humility and say, look, going into an interpreting situation, if there's a problem, if there's an issue, you're not going to know everything. You're going to have sometimes, even in the most comfortable situation, where you're not going to be able to do the best job, and you need to be willing to admit that and accept it, and then you'll be able to improve. Jenny's saying, certification, I guess, that is the best. You know, it's best to have someone who's certified, because then they know the rules of the game and they're a better interpreter. David's saying, gonna pause here. My phone's ringing.